And welcome back, Third Church family. We begin today our study of Second Samuel. In the first chapter, verse 17, hear these words. David took up this lament concerning Saul and his son Jonathan, and ordered that the men of Judah be taught this lament of the bow. It was written in the book of Yeshar. Your glory, O Israel, lies slain in your heights. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistine be glad, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised rejoice. O mountains of Gilboa, may you have neither dew nor rain, nor fields that yield offerings of grain. For there is the shield of the mighty was defiled. The shield of Saul no longer rubbed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the flesh of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back. The sword of Saul did not return unsatisfied. Saul and Jonathan, in life they were loved and gracious, and in death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lion. O daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorn your garments with ornaments of gold. How the mighty have fallen in battle, Jonathan lies slain on your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You are very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. How the mighty have fallen, the weapons of war have perished. May God add a blessing to the hearer, reader, and doer of his holy word. And I want to use for a subject as we deal with what is before us today, process of lament. Process of lament. Loss of any kind is traumatic in our lives, and our willingness to properly deal with the loss will have damaging effects on our lives and the lives of those around us. All of us will experience losses throughout our lives. We have family members and friends who die. Sometimes we lose jobs, we lose material possessions, we lose our health, we lose relationships because of conflict or relocation. There are other losses that are part of life. We usually can't control them, but what is in our control is how we respond to the loss we experience. And our response will determine if God is able to grow us from the loss and make us more like Jesus. I want us to receive this truth today. God, in his creation of us, never intended for us to be so attached to one another as human beings or an animal or an earthly possession that in its absence, we are rendered useless. This is not to diminish the importance of the relationship in our lives, but to drive home a point that the only one we cannot live without is God. Be careful when you say to someone, I can't live without you, because this is an offense to God, because all of a sudden they're gone and God is like, is that still your story? This morning, we're going to see how David dealt with loss in his life and see if we can't discover some principles that can help us make the most out of the losses in our life. In 1 Samuel 31, the Bible records that Saul and his three sons, including Jonathan, were killed in battle with the Philistines. Then at the beginning of 2 Samuel 1, an Amalekite man who appears before David with Saul's crown and armband claiming that he had killed and wounded Saul and Saul's request, David and his men immediately began the process of mourning for Saul and Jonathan. And then David has the Amalekite man killed for striking down the Lord's anointed. That brings us to 2 Samuel 1 and 17, and David's lament for Saul and Jonathan. This lament represents a pivotal point in David's life, for it stands as an epoch of transitions, his old life, present experience, and the beginning of life anew. David had been anointed king probably 10 to 15 years prior to this event. He had spent a good part of this time running from Saul, who was trying to kill him. But now that Saul is dead, the lament becomes an essential transition from that part of his life to his reign as king of Israel. I mentioned this word lament. Most of us today are not real familiar with this process of lament. The concept or process of lament is very important biblically. About 70% of the Psalms, many of them were written by David, are classified as laments. The prophet Jeremiah wrote a whole book of the Bible, the book of Lamentations, as a lament. And I want to give a working definition of lament. It's a process by which we make the most out of the losses we experience. Too often we can experience loss and allow the loss to imprison us. We are trapped. We feel that there's no way out. We're emotionally paralyzed, physically stagnant, just going through the motions of life. And there is the devastating part about it. Sometimes we are literally unaware of this imprisonment. And in the prison of loss, we can't be at our best because we have not taken the time to deal with our loss. Well, I pray that this is an emancipation morning. It is time to break free from the prison of loss and experience life as God has ordained it for all of us. Perhaps one of the reasons we have such a hard time with this concept of lament is that our culture has a tendency to trivialize human life, in addition to keeping us living in fear with overdoses of daily loss after loss after loss. If we watch and hear what is reported, regardless of the network's reporting, it's all bad, all loss with no lament. A continued emotional diet of loss. Then it gets normalized in our life where good news or making the most out of a loss is just dismissed. Now, understand, church, lament is not some rah-rah speech, nor is it the power of positive thinking, but it is a systematic approach to life as God has laid it out for us and ordained for it to be. Lament is about properly grieving or grieving in a healthy way. We think grieving is just about loss and someone close to us dying. And this is true, but grieving extends way beyond the grave. And I didn't actually understand that personally. I relegated grieving to funeral, loss of life, and didn't understand how other losses in life cause grief. And they have to be dealt with and not just put into the life happens box. We grieve all the time because we have losses all the time. They may be varying in their intensity, but it's grief nonetheless. We grieve when we fail a test, flunk a class. We don't do as well at something we had planned. We grieve when relationships fail. We grieve when we are betrayed. We grieve at the loss of job. We grieve at the failures of other loved ones. Unrealized potential brings grief. We grieve when there are major changes in life, relocations, the kids leave home. There is grieving of disease invading our body. There is grieving when we get older and we're not able to do the things that we used to do because of age. I could go on, but my point this morning, there's plenty of grieving in our life. And I feel it's misclassified or ignored. Therefore, we get imprisoned by the loss. So my job today is for us to develop our lament. And in doing that, we break free from the prison of loss. So in developing our lament, we must first acknowledge the loss. Acknowledge the loss. And I know you say, well, duh, I know it happened. Knowing something happened and acknowledging it happened are two different things. Because in acknowledging, there cannot be denial. Denial is a trap of the adversary. When we try to deny the reality of a loss, we will be living in a fantasy world. That fantasy is anything but sunny beaches. Part of not acknowledging the loss is minimizing its significance in our life. We try to be emotionally hard and say it didn't affect me. I'm good. You can't keep me down. It's going to be all right. And that's good for others, but we know that's far from our reality. Denying the loss is like ignoring a wound. Then it's infected and possibly destroy the body. And here's what denial does. We've not acknowledged the loss. Our actions get abusive for others in some kind of way. when we have not acknowledged that we've suffered a loss in someone dying, loss of job, relocation is tough for me. I miss the normalcy of family. I put a lot into this relationship and it being over has hurt me deeply. Loss of a parent not being there for me when I was growing up. You name it, it is a loss. When we don't deal with it, our back is constantly up against the prison wall of loss. And others in our lives are abused by our actions of a short fuse. They get cursed out. It may even show up in physical abuse of others or even physical abuse of ourselves through substance abuse, overeating that leads to obesity, and the list goes on. We convince ourselves that the loss isn't real and that it's no big deal. The problem of what kind of response it is, it doesn't allow us to go through the grieving process. It doesn't allow us lament. Ignoring losses in our life keeps us in prison. But there is no denial in David. The first thing he does is tear his clothes and begin the grieving process right in front of all of his men. I want us to be careful of this. Don't allow our need for acknowledging the loss be overshadowed by great gain. Here's what I'm saying. David has been waiting to become king for almost 15 years, and now Saul is dead. You would think there would be time to celebrate. Hey, I'm now the king. David realized the need for lament and grief. David had love for Saul, ultimate respect for his position as king. He grieved for Israel. All of this was necessary for him to boldly receive his new kingship. Acknowledging his loss enabled David to move on with the grieving process. As with us, don't let the celebration of what is to come keep us from acknowledging and dealing with present loss. Graduation, for instance, comes to mind. The celebration of the next level of life and not really giving true lament to the people we may not see again. Going from a place that's familiar to a place of mystery. Some may not be able to lament. They struggle. They didn't flunk out at the next level. They become functional alcoholics, just imprisoned in the loss. Loss of loved ones come to mind. We don't acknowledge the loss and we just think about the windfall of insurance money. But filling the hole in our heart with possessions or even another person leaves us broken financially, emotionally, spiritually, and even physically. Relationships come to mind. Been through a devastating relationship. We meet someone new and it's a great celebration of this newfound relationship. But the problem is we have not acknowledged how the last relationship devastated us. The new relationship suffers because we've not had proper lament. So our lament starts with acknowledging the loss. After we acknowledge the loss, we must, number two, refuse to dwell on past hurts. Refuse to dwell on past hurts. I'm amazed that David was able to mourn for Saul at all. After all, this man had been chasing him down for years, trying to kill David. But David's lament, Saul's death, just as much as the death of his best friend, Jonathan. David was able to do that because he was able to refuse to dwell on the past hurts that Saul had committed against David. Because we live in a world full of sinful human beings, others are going to hurt us. Others are going to be hurt by us. Hurt at the hands of others is a part of our continued reality. Sometimes unintentionally, other times very willfully. And it's often really difficult not to dwell on those hurts. I know that there are some of us tuning in this morning who are still harboring resentment and bitterness about some hurt in your life. Maybe someone hurt you really bad and now they've died and there is no way to resolve the hurt. Maybe someone cheated you out of some money or possessions. Maybe you have lost our health and we're blaming the doctors or angry at God for letting us get sick. I don't know exactly what it is in your life, but I'm pretty sure that it isn't as bad as what David had endured, being hunted down like a wild animal for over a decade. And I know for sure that it's not as bad as what Jesus endured on the cross on our behalf, so that God could forgive us. When personally, I'm not trying to dwell on past hurt, which means to live in them. I look at the words of the Apostle Paul spoke to the Colossian church in Colossians 3:13. Bear with each other and grieve whatever grievances you have against one another. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. So I need to release you so that I can be free. That boss, that ex-spouse, that abusive absent parent, that ex-friend, that relative, whomever and whatever it is in your life this morning, I release you so that I can be free. And when David refused to dwell on past hurts, he was able to then, number 3, incorporate past blessings. This is how David handles his grief for Jonathan. Jonathan and David were great friends. David described the love that he and Jonathan shared as being even greater than the love of that of a woman. Unfortunately, some of the commentators and other people with an agenda have eisegetically read into verse 26 suggests that David and Jonathan had a homosexual relationship. And I do need to pause to get into this for a moment, that you'll be more equipped to even offer sound reasoning against this argument. As always, context is critical in understanding scripture. The Hebrew word here for women used in verse 26 is pronounced isha, isha, which is the same word used for wife, woman, marriage, and female. We have come to the erroneous conclusion in our society that in order to love someone, you must have sex with them, and if no sex, there is no love. So if David says the love was greater than that of a woman, they must have had a sexual relationship. Well, not so fast. Now, in order to understand the context around what would make David say something like this, here is my reasoning. Now, understand up to this point, all of David's wives have been spoils of war given to him, or he received them as a result of something. So, in essence, all David has experienced is trophy wives. And even in our modern times, those who have trophy wives, it's understood that there may be love, but the love is limited by the arrangement. Not to say that there was no love between David and these wives up to this point, but it definitely wasn't the love that Jonathan had for David. This sacrificial love that Jonathan had for David to risk his life, to stand up to his crazy father and not gain anything just because he loved David. David had not experienced this before. And this is the love he's talking about in this verse. In some married couples, one may have a greater love relationship with a friend than they do their spouse. Not saying that it's right, but it's a reality. And that the sacrificial love David speaks of here, this is what he's talking about. Up to this point, David has not felt this way about any of his wives. That will change later, but up to this point, that's what we're working with. So back to our lesson. When we experience a loss in our life, one of the ways that we make the most of the loss is to reflect back upon the blessings that have come into our lives that are related to that loss. When we go to a funeral, we hear people reflect back upon the good things in a person's life and how they had a positive impact on the lives of others. This is an important part of the grieving and the lament process. No matter what kind of loss we suffer, there is almost always some type of blessings related to that loss. When we lose a relationship, we can choose to reflect back upon the good times in that relationship. When we lose a possession, we can focus on the blessings we receive while God allowed us to have the use of that particular item. When we lose our health, we can rejoice in those families and friends that go through that time with us. In breaking out of the prison of loss, we must be willing to express our grief with others. One of the things that strikes me about this passage is just how public David's grief was. Not only did David express his grief very publicly, but he invited others to join him in the process. In fact, David ordered that the lament be taught to the men of Judah and that be written down in the book of Yashar. By the way, there is one other reference to the book of Yashar in Joshua 10 and 13. We don't have any copies of that book today, but apparently it was some kind of written record that would have made it easier for David's lament to be passed on to others. One of the mistakes we often make when dealing with loss is that we try to withdraw and try to handle the grief on our own. But again, the evidence is that Withdrawal is a very unhealthy way to deal with our losses. It seems to me that one of the reasons that God intends for lament to take place within the community of believers is that we have the kind of encouragement and support that we need to deal with our loss and be able to move on with our lives. Unfortunately, my experience as pastor is that people are often reluctant to share their losses, their hurts with others because it may make them seem weak or vulnerable or not strong in their faith or whatever the reasons. I don't know how many times that I only find out about some loss in a person's life months and even years later because that person didn't want to share with others about their loss. I think of all the one another verses in the New Testament. Almost every one of those can apply to those who are hurting because of a loss. Love one another, serve one another, bear with one another, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgive one another, encourage one another, and build each other up. Spur one another on to love and to good deeds, but we can only reap the benefits of that kind of encouragement and help if we choose to experience our lament in community with others. Others may be one, two, it may be a group. Church, this is where we really start breaking free with our lament when we can begin to, number 4, visualize how God is working through the loss. You see, David didn't view the deaths of Saul and Jonathan as the end. It was only part of the process of God working through their lives for his ultimate good. I think this is what enabled David to forgive Saul and not focus on Saul's hate. Instead, David chose to focus on God's sovereignty and grace working through Saul's life. David also recognized that these deaths were a part of God's way of working in his life too. So many times when we suffer a loss, the first question we ask is, why, God? Why did my husband die? Why did I lose my job? Why did this person cheat me out of all of that money? Why did I get cancer? But I'm convinced from my understanding of Scripture that the question God wants us to ask is not why, but rather what or how. What do you want to do in my life as a result of this loss, God? How do you want to work in my life through this loss, God? In James 1, James commands us to respond to the trials in our life with joy. And I believe that verse 5 is the key to us being able to do that. In James 1 and 5, it says, if any of you lack wisdom, he should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him. Unfortunately, it seems that this verse is taken out of context and used as a general principle to pray to God for wisdom in our lives. Certainly, we ought to do that, but we need to remember that this verse is written in the context of responding to the trials in our lives with joy. I think that's why we need to ask God what and how in the midst of our losses. We need the wisdom to see how God is working in our lives through these losses. God has promised that he will work through our losses to bring good out of all of them. It states that clearly in Romans 8 and 28, and it says, and we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, been called according to his purpose. God can and God will bring good in our lives through our losses. If I'm reading this verse correctly, it says all things. And it seems to me that must include even our losses. So when I suffer loss, I need to visualize where God is at work through that loss. And when I understand that, I finally have the key in hand to unlock the door of the prison I have allowed loss to create in my life. With this key, I can finally engage life free and not as a prisoner of loss. I can now wake up empowered, not shackled. I can now wake up standing and climbing on the promises of God, not on the paralyzed by pain prison. It's certainly appropriate to take some time out to grieve when we suffer a loss. David and the rest of his people did that with Saul and Jonathan's death, but there is a tendency at times to withdraw and grieve so long that we fail to get on with life. This chapter begins with these words. In the course of time, David, see, we don't know how exactly long it took, but after an appropriate amount of time to grieve, David got on with his life and began the process of becoming king of Israel as a free man, not as a man imprisoned by loss. I can't give you some kind of chart that tells you how long to grieve before you get on with life after a loss. The time frame depends a lot on the magnitude of the loss. I know it takes a lot longer to move on with life after death of a spouse than some material possession, for instance. But healthy grieving, the process, it requires that there is a point that I have to get on with my life after a loss. And I'm convinced that there are some tuning in today that has never really resumed a normal life after a loss, even a loss that occurred years or even decades ago. Well, today, it's time for freedom. It's time to live as a free person. It's time to put away the bitterness, time to deal with the hurt, time to speak the hurt, time to talk to somebody, time to heal, time to break free. It's time for freedom from loss. It's time to live the abundant life of freedom Jesus died for us to have. But for today, we can acknowledge it's not all right. It's not all good. I didn't just get over it. I didn't just move on. Acknowledge I am in prison. I'm chained. I'm locked up. But also say, Jesus, rescue me. Jesus, deliver me. Jesus, restore unto me the joy of thy salvation. It's time to focus on the process of lament and be delivered today from the prison of loss. I want to thank you for tuning in today. We're going to continue next week in 2 Samuel with a sermon titled Promise Walkers. I pray that you join us as we continue to grow spiritually in our study of the Word of God. Until then, remember, be patient, be kind, be compassionate with everyone you come in contact with. May God bless you and keep you, and we'll see you next week.